I'm really honored to present here in front of you today. I have to start by admitting that I don't really know a whole lot about wine yet. So please forgive me for any mistakes I'm going to make in the wine part of this. So you may wonder then, how did she got here anyway? So in my first paper, I'm studying more the econometrics of auctions. And for my first paper, I collected data from the Sotheby's wine department. And during my reading, I then got into seeing the papers of Professor Ori Aschenfelter. And so he really inspired me because he was talking about the antitrust case of Sotheby's and Christie's that some of you may know, but in the mid-90s, these two auction houses, they have been fixing the sellers' commissions. And then there were a couple of papers after this work pioneered by Professor Aschenfelter that said, well, maybe the commissions weren't really harmful for successful bidders. Although there was a huge lawsuit and a huge settlement, and most of the money went to the bidders, actually, to the successful buyers of the wine. So that really got me thinking about how do commissions, and more generally, how does the price structure in auctions affect the welfare of the players concerned? And that's basically what I'm going to talk about. So I said most of this already, but the main point here is the fact that the fee structure in auctions is a primary source of competition amongst auction houses. And we saw from the antitrust case I just mentioned that market power of intermediaries may result in increase in these kind of fees, right? So here, this is the $500 million settlement that happened after this lawsuit of this antitrust case. But in auctions, in mechanism design, people usually think about how can we set the reserve price to maximize the seller's profits, and not so much how can we optimize the price structure to maximize the intermediaries' profits, right? Well, they are the people who decide the price structure anyway, so this may be an important question, more general, something you can keep in mind during this presentation. So what is the reason that successful bidders may not be worse off from such a price fixing scheme? Well, if you think about bidders, victory bidders, they can just reduce their bid by the amount of commission they have to pay. And if you combine that with completely inelastic supply on the seller side, then all the loss should be on the shoulders of the sellers. So that's basically the kind of one-sided environment that these couple of papers talk about. But then there's this more recent paper who said that, well, actually in auctions, you can think of this more as a two-sided market environment, because potential bidders have the choice to enter, so there's endogenous entry, and also sellers set the reserve price strategically. So they come up with a model where they show that under certain conditions, so higher commissions may actually increase the profit for the successful bidder. So it's even worse. And that's the reason is because it reduces the amount of competition that the bidders face. So there's going to be less entry, and therefore successful bidders may make a higher profit. But the key component of the model is the random entry assumption, which is basically driving these results. And this basically means that before entering the auction, potential bidders have no idea whatsoever about their valuations, about the product they're going to bid for. And this is really quite an extreme assumption to make. And recently in the auction literature, there's been, this has been recognized, and there's been much more work taking a bit more flexible entry model, which is called the affiliated signal entry model. And I'm going to talk about this in a bit more detail later on, but basically it allows for more flexible entry behavior, and it also nests random entry as a special case. So it's really more general. But the problem then, if you have such a bit more general models, that you cannot generate the unambiguous predictions that the previous theoretical model did have. So you cannot identify any more unambiguously what's going to be the effect of commissions on the welfare in the auction. So what I'm going to do is then, okay, first I'm going to introduce you to this model very briefly, because I know I'm the only thing standing in between you and the dinner, I think. But then I have a data set of online wine auctions, basically not very high-end auctions, but these data is from a website called Bid for Wine. It's kind of a major UK auction website, but not very high-end wine. But anyway, okay, so there's exogenous variation in the delivery fees, and I'm going to show you that it's exogenous, but for now just bear with me. So there's exogenous variation in the delivery fees, and this allows me then to non-parametrically estimate the impacts of changes in fees, actually. So first of all, I'm just going to talk about changes in fixed cost, and then I'm going to show you how does this relate, how can you interpret this as the effect of changes in commissions as well, but I'll do that in the end. Okay, so I'll just walk you through some parts of the model quickly. Okay, so we just have an English auction with symmetric potential bidders. And so why do we have entry? Because, okay, we're going to have entry cost. And in online auctions, the entry costs are usually thought of as the time it takes to compare listings and the time it takes to decide on a bidding strategy or something. So it's really not a monetary cost, but it's really the time cost that you have to commit to enter this auction. Okay, so we have endogenous entry, then potential bidders who have valuation VJ and signal XJ. For them it's a two-stage process. They first decide to enter, then they have to bid, right? Okay, so this is the affiliated signal part of the model. It basically says that the random pairs, the signal and the valuation, are drawn symmetrically across potential bidders from their joint distribution, such that, and this is, I know this looks maybe daunting, but this is just the idea that if you draw a higher signal, x prime, then the probability that your valuation is below some v is going to be less than if you draw a lower signal. And this basically just, in normal words, means that a high signal is good news. So if you have a high signal, it's more likely that your valuation is also going to be higher. And you see that this nests the random entry model, because if this would be an equal sign, you would have the random entry model, but it allows for much more flexible ways of thinking about entry in auctions. Okay, and I will empirically verify that actually it is important to relax this random entry assumption with this data. But yeah, as I said in the introduction, it's also logically, it makes sense in many auction environments not to have this extreme assumption there. Okay. Okay, so what's the price structure in the auction? So the intermediary sets the commissions, right? There's a percentage CS for the seller and CB for the buyer. But the delivery cost, which is CD, makes sense, no? It's a fixed amount, so that's why this bar is here. So it's not a percentage of the hammer price, right? So it's just a fixed amount. The seller sets it, but the buyer has to pay it. Okay. So you only have to keep track of CD and CB, basically. So what do the bidders do? So this is already the second stage, so I'm going to work backwards. So in the second stage, Vickery bidders, they just, when you rationalize this as a Vickery auction, they just basically bid their valuation, but adjust it for the cost that they have to pay. When you say that H is the realized hammer price, it's just the maximum of the reserve price, and this is the second highest bid, right? So this is the second highest valuation adjusted for cost. Okay, so we have the hammer price. So the surplus for the winning bidder is clearly just his valuation, this valuation of the highest bidder, minus the hammer price adjusted for the commission, and minus the shipping cost, in case the lot gets sold, and of course it's zero otherwise. Well, N star, so everything with a star is basically an equilibrium outcome. So N star is the equilibrium number of entrants or number of bidders, which is determined in the first stage. I'm not going to say everything, but it's just, since we have this affiliated signal entry model, and the high signal is good news, this gives you the result that there's some kind of threshold entry, equilibrium entry. So you only enter when your signal xj is higher than some common threshold, which is an equilibrium threshold. But basically it means that the number of bidders here is just decreasing in the cost and decreasing in the reserve. Okay, and this is also something that you can test in the data, so to show that whether this model makes sense or not. So this is something empirically tested. The seller, okay, he sets the reserve price, and of course he also just sets it by maximizing his profits. Okay, so yeah, okay, maybe I shouldn't say too much about this, but this is basically just kind of the flavor of the model, so that everybody knows what kind of an entry model we're thinking about. But what are the implications? So if you think about the question, how do commissions affect the bidders? Well, basically, you can just take it from the consumer surplus and take the derivative, right? So that's common sense. And okay, you can decompose this into components. So one component, if you think about compensating successful bidders after the event of some anti-competitive behavior, you only have to think about the hammer price effect, which is just the change in how much you have to pay if it gets sold. But otherwise, maybe you have to add another effect, which is a change in the probability of selling the lot, which may also change the welfare in these auctions. But okay. Okay, so the point of all of this is that these are quantities. So this hammer price effect and the sale effect are things that you can estimate if you have exogenous variation in the relevant cost components, without needing to estimate a full structural model or without having to parameterize the joint entry and reserve price setting behavior. So that's what I'm going to do next. Okay, let me first say a little bit about the data. So this is the website, Bid for Wine. You can basically scrape the data from this website because they have a sold auction part and all the information is right there. So for example, this is one of the listings. I don't know anything about this wine. I don't know if this is a good deal actually. So this is £25 for this 2004 bottle of Chateau Lynch Moussos. But so here's all the relevant information, the number of bidders. We have kind of detailed information about the origin of the wine. And then here is the part where the seller sets the delivery cost, right? So this £12 here, that's really just decided by the seller. And this is going to be the variation that I will use to estimate the impacts. So yeah, this is what it looks like. I just took 10,000 auctions. I excluded some that I couldn't work with for some reason or other. But so on average, they're like £95 for about 4.5 bottles. Well, this gives you 84% chance of selling the lot, more things. So the shipping costs here they vary a lot. So from nothing, so this is the case that the seller says, okay, I'm going to pay for it, to £150. So that's a lot of variation. Oh, you can't see this at all. Okay. Okay, but this is the claim I made, that these shipping costs are going to be exogenous, and they're going to be exogenous. They have to be exogenous to the joint distribution of valuations and signals conditional on other observables. Otherwise, this whole estimation part doesn't go through, right? So basically, you can't see it here, but I do show that they are completely independent of valuations by this test. You have to believe me, and here I don't think you can see these here also, because here are a lot of light blue dots, but also you can see that the delivery costs don't change significantly over time, which is important because you want to say something like, this is the impact of changing cost, holding alternative fixed, or something. Okay, so some empirical patterns you can find in this data that kind of support the theoretical model. So for once, you reject this one-sided market with inelastic supply hypothesis. Yeah, okay. And you reject the random entry model, which is most important for motivating, relaxing this, and having to come up with this whole alternative strategy. And also you see that the number of bidders indeed decreases with costs, which is a clear prediction of the model. So that's all great. So this kind of supports, okay, this model makes sense for this data as well. And let me just finally get you to the results. Okay, so yeah, just to summarize this, how do you estimate it then non-parametrically? So first you need to have an estimate of the expected consumer surplus to see how it changes with cost, of course. So you do that by estimating, so you need to estimate the distribution of valuations of entrants, conditional on observables. And observables I used that you may find interesting is from the website is the type of wine, so red, sparkling white, the vintage, the volume, the sub-region of origin, which is very narrowly defined, ullage, I don't even know if you pronounce that like ullage, but okay. So the ullage, yeah, okay, so that's, yeah, okay, you know what it is. So, no, I know what it means. I just, I was going to explain it, but then I thought I shouldn't have to explain this to you. So, when the auction closed, whether or not you can collect the bottle, the type of insurance included in the shipping cost. So yeah, this may be important because, yeah, so the type of insurance is especially important because the shipping cost may be higher when there is a different degree of insurance offered, right? Some shippers say, oh, okay, we insure breakage, or we insure loss, or we insure nothing, or optional. So this is important because it affects both valuations and the height of the shipping cost. So this is included as well. Then just, you just do a local linear regression of the estimated surplus on the shipping cost here. And then you can estimate both the hammer price effect and the sale effect. So this is, these are some results. Okay, so this is the 0 here. So this is basically shows you that increasing delivery costs with 1 additional pound at, say, below average levels of cost actually does increase the surplus of the winning bidder. But at higher, this is conditional on a sale, but at higher cost, it will reduce their surplus. And the sale effect, this is kind of surprising because it basically says that at low levels of cost, increasing the delivery cost increases the probability of a sale here, because otherwise it would never be positive, this effect. So, and since I am not pinning down a separate effect of the reserve price and the entry, and since we know that entry decreases with cost, we know that this must be because the sellers must reduce their reserve price at these regions. Okay, so if you add them up, you get the total impact. Okay, and finally, may think, how does this relate to the antitrust case? Okay, so just to summarize, in 1992, they increased the buyer's commission from 10% to 15%, well, independently of each other, they say. So they actually never agreed to fixing buyer's commissions, only seller's commissions. But still, they increased the commission by 5%. The litigation of this antitrust lawsuit concludes that buyers were overcharged 5% of the hammer price, and 2/3 of the total settlement in the end went to successful bidders. So what I'm going to do is, with this data, I'm going to calculate the effect of a 5% increase in commission from a level of 10% upwards. Okay, so I don't have variation in commissions, so I need to impose the consistency of the expected hammer price, which basically means that the hammer price that consumers expect to happen is consistent with the realized hammer price. Okay, so this may be a little bit like a hand-waving thing to think about, because yeah, there's no way to really verify this in your data or anything, but just to know that to interpret the results as a change in commission, this is the assumption you need, because then the cost as a share of the expected hammer price equals the cost of a share as a share of the hammer price, which is the definition of CB. So it's a percentage cost. Okay, so what you get then is that here you see that increasing the commission actually increases, because increases buyers' surplus for any amount. So when it's when the original amount was less than about 20% of the total hammer price, and in most wine auctions, commissions are somewhere between 0 and 20%. So that may be something to keep in mind. But at higher regions, increasing commissions may reduce their surplus. And so this is what you get if you calculate the effect of a 5% increase from 10%. So the bidder, his benefit is 9% of the hammer price in the auctions I have in the data. So if you would translate this to the kind of magnitudes that we had in the antitrust case in the 90s, is that bidders would have gained 614 million and they wouldn't have lost 341 million. So in that case, if you would transport like the whole institutional environment, this settlement would have been wrong. But you can also see here that the intermediary here actually loses 17% of the hammer price, which is a clear indication that, I will almost stop, but this is really a clear indication that yeah, the institutional environment is different, because nobody would have a price fixing scheme where they would lose 17% of the hammer price just because of that. So what are the differences? So I'm just mentioning two here. One of them is multi-homing. So basically the thing is that the elasticity of the hammer price to changes in commissions is much higher in the current data than in the 90s data. But that was the era, say, pre-internet, and this is really an online auction where you would expect also that bidders have a much higher sensitivity to changes in commissions than it was the case in the mid-90s, when there may also have been less competition amongst institutions. So this overestimates the positive impact on buyers, and it also overestimates the negative impact on sellers and intermediaries. And the final thing is that the wines in these auctions are relatively, you can think of them more as maybe commodity products or commodities, while Christie's and Sotheby's, they auction more high-end art and wines. So you can think of having more of a common value component in these kind of auctions. And this also makes that, the institution can create some kind of marquee buyers or some uniqueness that also reduces sensitivity of the hammer price to commissions. Okay, so that's it. I'm not going to repeat myself with the conclusions, but I'm going to leave it at that.